me the story of Jesus. Write on my heart every word. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard. Loving that story so tender, clearer than ever I see. Say, let me read what you whisper, love in the ransom for me. Tell me the story most precious, sweetest that ever was heard.
Hello. Do I need to start over? No? Okay. Last week we looked at one doctrinal position, and that is the idea that God merely foresees everything that happens and then sanctions everything that happens. In other words, that man has total and absolute free will to do whatever he wants to do, and God foresaw all of those actions, and as a result of seeing those actions, then wrote his prophecies based on what he'd foreseen. That the affairs of mankind are dealt completely by the free will of mankind. We proved that to be an error last week. That's not how it works. God is intimately involved in everything that goes on down here. So we dealt with that position last week. This week we want to look at the other position. And this is the idea that God controls everything, which he does, but we want to show you how it is that he controls everything without being chargeable for being the author of sin. Turn to Isaiah chapter 46 to begin this morning. This is a passage that we closed with last week. Isaiah 46 verses 9 through 11. Say, remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is none else. I am God and there is none like me. Declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my pleasure. Calling a ravenous bird from the east, the man that executeth my counsel from a far country, yea, I have spoken it, I will also bring it to pass. I have purposed it, I will also do it. Now the question that I want to ask this and what I want to deal with this morning is, how does he do it? We recognize the fact that God controls the affairs of mankind, that he's in total control of what goes on down here. But how does he go about doing it? Does he permit some things to happen, or does he cause all things to happen? Does he make them happen? Does he manipulate mankind as a puppeteer manipulates a puppet? Or is there some other method in which he is in total and complete control of what goes on in the universe, but not the same as being the puppeteer? You see, if you're the puppeteer pulling the strings of the puppet, then you're responsible for what the puppet does. If I cause you to sin, I'm responsible for your sin. This is one of the problems that we have with people that fly jet airplanes into the World Trade Center. It is their position that God absolutely predestined everything to happen exactly the way that it will happen. And it can do nothing else. It has to happen that way. And so when I fly an airplane into a building, well, that's not really me doing it, it's God doing it. Okay? So, I mean, that's the idea of absolute predestination. I want to show you that that's not the way the Bible teaches it. It teaches that God's in control, but not from the standpoint that He's the one that authored sin. He did not force Adam to eat of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. Adam made that choice for himself. So there's the idea on one extreme that we covered last week, the far extreme over here that God doesn't control anything, and then the other far extreme over here that God controls everything by predestinating it. We're going to find that the Bible teaches it somewhere in the middle, which is very common. The first thing I want you to look at is James chapter 1. James chapter 1, because if God is the one that's in control to the point that He causes someone to do something, then He's guilty of what James says He's not guilty of here. James chapter 1 and verse 13 says, "Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth He any man. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed." You see, we're responsible for what we do down here. We can't blame that on God. If we commit sin, that's our fault. We're drawn away of our own lust. God did not cause us to sin. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, which clearly teaches that man is responsible for what he does. And if God controls us like a puppeteer controls a puppet, then God's responsible for what we do. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 10 says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that every one may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad." We're going to stand accountable for what we do, not for what God makes us do. Look at Romans chapter 14 and verse 12. Romans 14 and verse 12 says, "So then every one of us shall give an account of himself to God." Now, if God manipulates people the way that a puppeteer manipulates a puppet, then it's God that's responsible for whatever that puppet does, not us. But in fact, we're responsible. Now, I want to go through some definitions of some terms this morning. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at some definitions, because there are a couple of words that are many times used as synonyms, and they're very close to being synonyms, but not exactly. The first word I want to look at is the word predestinate. We find that word in the King James Bible. And in the King James Bible, the word predestinate is translated from the Greek word perizo, which is Strong's number 49 or 4309 in your dictionary if you wish to look that up. It means to limit in advance. In other words, to predetermine, to determine before, to ordain, to predestinate. That's what the word predestinate means. When you read it in your King James, that's what the Greek word means that's translated predestinate. It's derived from the word horizo, which is Strong's 3734, which means to mark out or bound, as in a horizon, to appoint, decree, specify, declare, determine, limit, or ordain. This is what that word actually means. Now there's another word that we want to look at, because we're going to find something very, very similar to this found in the Bible, and this is the word predetermined. The word predetermined comes from the Latin determinare, which means to determine beforehand, to fix, settle, or decide beforehand, to ordain or decree beforehand, or to predestinate. You see how predetermined and predestined are used in many cases very similarly, almost as if they're synonyms. The word determine means to bound, to limit, to determine, to fix. It comes from the prefix "d" and the Latin terminare, which means to set bounds to put an end or a limit to come to an end. A good example of this is found over in Job chapter 14. If we flip over there real quick. Job chapter 14 and verse 5 says, "Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed his bounds that he cannot pass." So God determines things. He determines everything that he wants to have happen. And we're going to show that in the scripture. But he does not absolutely fix and predestine everything that happens. He has determined the bounds of things that he will allow to happen, but does not absolutely predestine them to happen. The word destined from destare means to make fast or firm, establish, destine. You see, if something is predestined, it takes on the position that it can't be nothing else can be changed. If God predestinates something, and he does predestinate some things, and we're going to look at that. If it's predestined, it cannot be any other way. It's that way and that way only. If it's determined, we'll show how that works, where he's predetermined what will happen. He knows the end from the beginning. He's involved in the affairs of man's lives, but man's still responsible, rather than him setting it in advance. When we look at this word perizo, if you turn to Acts chapter 4, we find an interesting thing in Acts chapter 4, and we're talking about at this point at the crucifixion of Christ. And when we see this word used in relation to the affairs of wicked men, we find something very interesting. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 28, we read, "For to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done." Notice it wasn't predestined, it was determined before. What happened at the crucifixion of Christ was determined beforehand, but it was not predestined beforehand, as we're going to show as we continue through this. Now let's look at a couple of other passages that use this word perizo, okay? Don't worry, there's not that many. We don't find it 150 times, so it's not going to take that long. This is one. Another one is found over in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8, verses 29 and 30. We will find that it's used twice in this passage. Romans 8:29 says, "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called, and whom he called, them he also justified, and whom he justified, them he also glorified." In these two passages, the word perizo is translated predestinate. This is something that is absolutely fixed in advance by God and cannot be changed in any way, shape, or form. What is it that he predestinated, however? Read the passage. For whom he did know, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's something that God's children are absolutely predestinated to. You cannot change that. There is nothing you can do to change the fact that God predestinated you, if you're one of his elect, to be conformed to the image of his Son. That's one thing that you're predestinated to. Okay? That's one. Now let's look at another passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. And verse 7. 1 Corinthians 2 and verse 7 says, "But we speak the wisdom of God in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which God ordained before the world unto our glory." The word ordained there is the word that's translated from perizo. Okay? That's not really telling us what anything about predestination, is it? That's a reference text. But let's look at another proof text. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 1. This is the only other place where we're going to find the word predestinate. We've seen it twice in Romans. We're going to see it 2 more times in Ephesians. And it's going to tell us something else about what God predestinates us to. Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 5. Well, let's go back to verse 3 just to get the context. "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who hath blessed us with all spiritual blessings in heavenly places in Christ, according as he hath chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will." Notice, we are predestined to be adopted children. Now, there's 2 things we've seen. We are predestined to be conformed to the image of Christ, and we are predestined to be adopted as children. Those 2 things, if you are one of God's elect, you are predestined to that, and there's nothing you can do to change it. I don't know why you would want to change it, but the fact of the matter is that is set in advance and cannot be changed in any way, shape, or form. If you are one of God's children, you've been predestined to be adopted as a child and to be conformed to the image of Christ. On the day of judgment, you will stand behind Christ and God will see him rather than your works. And therefore, you will be accounted in what he did rather than what you did. Now, let's look at the only other place in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 11. This is the only other reference for this. It says, "In whom also we have obtained an inheritance, being predestinated according to the purpose of him who worketh all things after the counsel of his own will." These are the items that are predestinated. God has predestinated these things. Everything else he has predetermined, as we saw over on that verse in Acts, where he had determined before what his counsel had determined before what to be done. So with regard to the wicked works, that it's important to understand that man is the efficient cause of those, not God. God did not predestinate those Jews to hang Jesus on a cross. He predetermined that they would do it. And we're going to see something critical as we continue with this study. But the choices that men make are sometimes permitted. There are things that are permitted that God will suffer men to do, that he will allow them to do to bring about what he needs to be brought about. And there are times when he will allow men to be as wicked as men want to be to bring about the purpose that God has already predetermined to happen. But in so doing, it's the man that's responsible for the action, because I'll tell you something now, and I'll prove it in a minute. Regardless of what it is that's out there, you can always say no, and you can always do righteous. If you have options in front of you and one of them is wicked, there's one of them that isn't wicked, and you can choose the one that's not wicked. Therefore, if you choose wicked, you're responsible for it, not God, because he always makes available an option not to go wicked. And I'll prove that in just a few minutes. So, since God knows what men will do, he knows exactly what we'll do. Under any scenario, he knows what every one of us will do given a certain scenario. He knows that. He knows everything. Since he knows that, he's able to limit our actions to just those things that he's willing to have us do. You see, if there's something that he knows that if there's a sin that he knows that you would fall into if presented with the opportunity, and he's not going to allow you to fall into that, but he knows you would if presented with it, he'll close the door on that opportunity. You'll never see it. You'll never even know that it was out there. It will never present itself to you. He will only allow you to go so far. Now let's look at the case of the crucifixion of Christ. In the case of the crucifixion of Christ, which is a really good example of this, God appointed the limits to the voluntary actions of those wicked men. Think about the time frame of when Christ was crucified. The political system at the time that Christ came into the world was such that the only way that anyone could be put to death, the only system of capital punishment, was for the Romans to hang you on a tree. Now, God had prophesied down through centuries that that's what was going to happen, and he brought about the affairs of the world so that at the time Christ came into the world, there was only two options. Well, there was one. They tried to stone him a couple of times, but that was illegal. They weren't allowed to do that. But for a capital crime, the only punishment was to take him to the Romans and let the Romans hang him on a tree. That was it. That was the only thing available to them. But there was something else available to them. I want you to notice that God had restrained them by the activity of the political times in which they lived to just that one act. Christ did not come into the world at a time when they could use electrocution, when they could use lethal injection, when they could hang him the only thing they could do is crucify him. That's all that was available to them. That was their only choice. So God had limited the choices down to that point because that's what needed to be done. In order to save the elect, that's what had to be done. So God limited them down to this point, but I want you to think about something. How many times did Pontius Pilate plead with them to let him go? How many times did he stand before them and say, I find no fault in this man? He came before him at one point and offered, based on the Jewish tradition, that one could be set loose at the Passover. And he brought out the Charles Manson of the day as the example. And what did they do? They picked Manson. You see, they could have let him go. Those Jews could have said, okay, let him go. But they didn't choose good. They chose evil, therefore they're responsible for it. And that crucifixion is one of the ways that we see how God deals with the wickedness that we have to come into presence with. Look at Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22 and verse 22. where we read, "And truly the Son of Man goeth as it was determined, but woe unto that man by whom he is betrayed." You see, even Judas Iscariot could have not done what he did. He betrayed Christ of his own free will. He wasn't predestinated to do that, but God knew that he'd do it, and he knew what the price would be to get him to do it. And so things were set in order, but it's still Judas's fault for saying, "Yeah, I'll do it. I'll turn him in." And that's why Christ said, "Woe unto that man." Look at Acts chapter 2 and verse 23. We read, "Him being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain." You see, they were the ones that were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. It wasn't God that was responsible for that. God knew in their hearts, knew what they would do, knew that if given the opportunity, they would nail Christ to a cross, and he knew that that's what needed to be done. Now, I want you to understand something. He knows that about every one of you, too. He knows everything about you as well. He knows what you will do, and whatever it is that you do, it will end up solving, you will end up doing God's will somehow. Now, you may have to take the long road to get there, or you might be able to take the shortcut. If you do good, then you end up taking a shortcut. If you take the long road, you might get beat to death from time to time, because God will chastise you if you fall into sin. But it's your decision to make whenever opportunity and whenever options come before you. Now, we looked at this word predestined, predestinated. In every case where the word predestinated is used in the Bible, it applies to the act of God in bringing men to sonship and conformity to the image of Christ. We've looked at all the passages, and that's what predestination is. Predestination takes some of the fallen race of mankind, changes their destiny without regard to anything that they do or anything that is found within themselves. It deals with men as fallen. We saw that in Ephesians. And men are passive in attaining to what it is that God predestinates them to. That's what predestination deals with. It deals with God setting the end to those people that he has chosen to be his children from before the foundation of the world. That's what predestination deals with. And we've already looked at the passages. We looked at Romans 8:29 through 30, Ephesians 1:5, and Ephesians 1:11, and that's the totality of the passages that use the word predestinate in the King James Bible. You won't find it anywhere else. Everything else God deals with by predetermination, not by predestination. Therefore, since God's not the efficient cause of all things that occur, He's not responsible for the sin of man. He did not make Adam eat of the fruit in the Garden of Eden. Adam did that of his own free will. Adam plunged mankind into sin. He does not make you do sinful acts when you do them. You do those of your own free will, and you are therefore responsible for them. And I'll tell you, if you're a child of God, you're going to pay for those sinful acts in this life. If you're not, well, you'll pay for them later. But you'll pay for them. But you can't go back and blame God for it. You can't say, well, God made me do it. Because God didn't make you do anything. The only thing that God makes you do, if you're one of His children, is become one of His children. So men function freely and responsibly within the imposed boundaries that God allows them. You know, when I was flying home from Dallas this week, looking out the window of the airplane, it was really evident some of the rivers, that especially on the leg from Charlotte, going into Charlotte, just before we got into Charlotte, you could see, I don't know what the name of the rivers were, but you could see these rivers that were just kind of twist, I can't think of the word, shoulder's hurting. But they kind of meandered along. There it is. This is the way that God controls men. And I'm going to show you this in a verse in a few minutes. This is how he does things. He will let things go to a point, and then he'll change it. You look at the number of Jews that Adolf Hitler killed. He didn't kill them all. You look at people like Jeffrey Dahmer, or other mass killers. Yeah, they did a lot of bad stuff, but it could have been worse. He restrained them at one point, and we're going to show that that's what God does. He will restrain it. Look at Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15 and verse 18. Says, known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. God knows everything that's going to happen, and he's involved in the affairs of mankind to make sure that nothing happens that he does not permit to happen. And he will only let evil go so far. So he does direct the flow of events, but he's not the force or the behind those events. Men do that. He allows men to do what men do. His predetermination of all things is evident from the fact that nothing can occur unless God permits it to occur. He permitted Adam to sin, but he didn't make Adam sin. The word permit means to allow, to suffer, to give leave, not to prevent something. And God's permission is taught in several scriptures. First, I want you to turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And we'll see how this position is taught in the scriptures. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 7. Where Paul says, for I will not see you now by the way, but I trust to tarry a while with you, watch it, if the Lord permit. How many times do we in our lives say, well, if Lord willing, we'll get together on such and such a day. When we moved our friends down from Colorado, it was Lord willing, we'll be able to move them down here. God permits what goes on. And we have to remember that. Look at Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 3. We'll look at another one. Excuse me. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 3. And this we will do if God permit. You see, there are a lot of things that we might plan to do, but if God decides no, it's not going to come about. If God allows it to come about, then God allows it to come about. He permits it. And it's the same way on the righteous side as it is on the wicked side. God only allows certain things. Look at Acts chapter 13. Acts chapter 13 and verse 18. Let's look at verse 17 for the context. The God of this people of Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with an high arm brought he them out of it, and about the time of 40 years suffered he their manners in the wilderness. He permitted it. He suffered it. He put up with it. Look at Acts 14:16. Speaking of God, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. This is something that God was permitting to have happen. Wasn't that he necessarily liked it to happen, but he suffered it to happen. He allowed it to happen. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, "There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man." Now watch this. "But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that ye may be able to bear it." You see, like I said earlier, if there is a specific sin that God knows that you would fall into if given the option, you will never be given that option unless he permits it to happen. He takes care of us in that sense. He will only let us go so far. And it's the same with the wicked. He will only let them go so far. So you see, God's permission is taught in those scriptures, and since everything is predetermined by God, then that's why we always say that if the Lord will, we will do this. If God permit, we will do this. Look at James chapter 4. James chapter 4, verse 13. "Go to now that ye say today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that." And that's the way that we should look at everything. Yeah, you should plan for the future, but you should also understand that if God decides something different, then something different is going to come about. If the Lord wills, this is what we'll do. And he is in control. So we fulfill our will only within the limits of God's will. But it's important to understand that it's us that are doing what we're doing. God didn't force us to do any of this. Turn to Psalm chapter 76. This is the passage that I was referring to a little bit earlier when I was talking about the rivers and couldn't come up with the word meander. Psalm chapter 76. Oh, I'm sorry, this isn't that passage. This is a different passage. Psalm 76, verse 10 says, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee, the remainder of wrath shalt thou restrain." You see, he will only let things go so far. To restrain something means to check, to hold back or prevent a person or a thing from some course of action. The remainder of wrath is the wrath that did not occur because God disallowed it to occur. The reason that Adolf Hitler was not able to completely wipe out the Jews was because God didn't permit Adolf Hitler to completely wipe out the Jews. The reason that Charlie Manson was only able to take care of, to kill off the people at Sharon Tate and the La Bianca homes was because that's as far as God would allow him to go. God will restrain the activities of evil men to a point so that only what he allows takes place. Now, maybe this is semantics, but it's one thing for God to allow a sin to take place, and it's quite another for him to be the efficient cause of the sin. Do you see how that does that make sense? It's one thing to allow it, it's another to make it happen. And so in that sense, God is able to allow things to happen without being the author of the sin. If I were to hold a baseball in my hand and I let go of it, okay, is my letting go of it the cause of it falling to the ground? No. Gravity is the cause of it falling to the ground. My letting go of it is merely allowing gravity to take its natural course. And so if God lets go of things and lets men do what their wicked hearts want them to do, then he didn't cause their wicked hearts to do what they did. Their wicked hearts caused them to do that. And God merely let go of the ball and let gravity take its course. Look at Proverbs chapter 21. This is the verse I was looking for. Proverbs chapter 21. And verse 1. The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, as the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. And it was such a perfect example of this. Fly over a river sometime and take a look at it. From the air, it doesn't seem that there's any reason why it would turn at that particular spot. Look at the Grand Canyon. Look how it meanders along. Why did it turn there? What's the same with a king? The way God handles a king, the way he handles a president, the way he handles a Congress, the way he handles anything in this world. He will allow it to go so far and no farther, and then he will turn it back the other direction, just like a river. And that's the way that he's controlled the affairs of life. Turn to Job chapter 26. Because, see, water is directed by boundaries, and within those boundaries, it flows freely. Just as man is able to live within boundaries and do it as he wishes within those boundaries that God has set for him. Job chapter 26 and verse 10. He hath compassed the waters with bounds until the day and night come to an end. You see, there are boundaries on these things. Look at Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38, verses 8 through 11. This is God speaking to Job. And he says, or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth, as if it had issued out of the womb? When I made the cloud the garment thereof, and thick darkness a swaddling band for it, and break up for it my decreed place, and set bars and doors. And he said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thou proud waves be stayed. You see, God will allow things to happen to a point and no farther. But it is not God causing those things to happen. He's allowing them to happen. And remember that whenever an option is laid before you in your life, there is always an option to do good. Whenever you come to a fork in the road, whether that fork has 6 different forks or 2, one of them at least will be an option to do righteousness. And if you pick the evil one, you'll pay for picking the evil one. That was your will that picked it. God didn't force you to do that. But you can always pick the right one. Now let's answer a couple of questions here. Here's some common questions, and then we'll go ahead and close this study, some common questions regarding the subject. Are major events of my life predestinated, such as the wife I have, or the job I get, or the house I buy, or the country or state that I'm born in, or how many children I have? There's the amen corner. Are those things predestinated? And the answer is no. They're not predestinated. The day that you're going to die is not predestinated. Where you live is not predestinated. Who your parents weren't. Those items are predetermined. God predetermines those, but He doesn't predestinate them. My parents and I act freely in those matters of where we live, how many children we have, what kind of car I drive, what suit I put on to wear to church this morning. Those are things that may have been determined, but they're not predestined. God did not fix those things in advance. Another question, since all the elect are going to heaven, are they all predestinated to be conceived or born? And the answer is no. They may not be born. It doesn't matter if they're born. If God elected them to go to heaven, then they will go to heaven, whether they're born or not. I would now I don't have a Bible verse to prove this, but I would kind of like to think that a lot of those children that our government keeps aborting by the millions, they may be God's elect. I'd like to think they are. I don't know. I don't have a Bible verse. But predestination is a decree of God that deals with the destiny of men viewed as conceived and born. And so we're talking about the end state of His elect. And the end state of His elect are that they will be adopted as children and they will be conformed in the image of Christ. That will happen whether they're born or not, makes no difference. Is a time, year, date, hour, minute predestined for us to die? And the answer to that is no, it's not. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 26. And let's consider what David said concerning Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 26. And at this point, Saul was chasing David. David had had a couple of opportunities to kill Saul off, and he didn't take them. And his men couldn't understand why. Why didn't you just go ahead and get it over with? And David said in 1 Samuel chapter 26 and verse 10, David said furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. You see, there wasn't a set day for Saul to die. God could take him whenever God felt like taking him, or he could end up in a battle and die that way, or he could just die of natural causes. Now, it is true that we can hasten our own death by doing certain things. Walk out in front of a Peterbilt that's doing 115 miles an hour, and chances are you're not going to live through it. But God didn't predestinate you to step out in front of a Peterbilt that's doing 100 and whatever miles an hour. And if you don't walk out in front of it, well, you'll probably live at least a little bit longer than if you had of. So those dates are not predestinated. What parts of the Bible are predestinated? And we've already looked at those over in Romans and in Ephesians. Everything else is predetermined, as we saw in Acts. Let's turn back over there to Acts chapter 4. Acts chapter 4 and verse 28. Well, let's move back for the context. Let's go back a little bit. Go back to verse 23. And being let go, they went to their own company and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said unto them. And when they heard that, they lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God, which hath made heaven and earth, and the sea and all that in them is, who by the mouth of thy servant David has said, why did the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up together, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and with the people of Israel were gathered together. Now watch this. For to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. God had determined that that was the way that Christ had to die. But remember, the Jews could have set Christ free. And since they could have set him free, they bear the guilt. So that was not predestinated. That was predetermined. God knew that that's what they would do if given the opportunity. And so that's what he allowed them to do. Here's one. Is a preacher predestined to preach to whomever he preaches? And the answer to that is no. His line of ministry is predetermined. I'll give you an example. God knew, and God's the only one that did know, he knew under what terms I would accept the pastorate of the Lakeland Church. We had an agreement going back before Conrad and I ever came out here, that if things fell out a certain way, then that meant that he wanted me to come here. And that was the only way that I could have the comfort in knowing whether or not I should come here. He didn't predestinate me to be here, but he brought the events about in such a way that it answered my questions, so that, because he knew that if that came to be, that I would be willing to take the charge. So it wasn't predestined that I would be here, but it was predetermined that I would be here. I chose freely within the limits of what I had. In other words, see, God didn't force me to do this. That was a choice that I made, but God showed me through various things that this is where I was supposed to be. Okay, is the subject matter of prophecies predestinated? And the answer to this is that if the prophecy deals with the eternal destiny of God's elect children, yes. In that case, yes. If we're dealing with the eternal destiny of God's children, that is predestinated. Anything else is not. Now see, God prophesied the crucifixion of Christ, but he didn't predestinate the crucifixion of Christ. But he so dealt with the affairs in this world that at the time that Christ came into the world, that was the only option available to the Jews other than to let him go. And he knew that they wouldn't let him go. And so he brought it about, he controlled it, but he was not guilty of the sin of hanging his own son on the cross. Okay? Now I hope this helps with some of those nagging questions that people have about these types of things. I could go into a little more detail, but I don't really think it's necessary, and we've about used the time for this morning. So with that, I thank you for your kind and patient attention. And let's stand and sing number 37.